Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everybody. So we're going to make a start. So can I ask you all to sit down? So to start this marathon day, this very hot day, we're going to start with an important question for the future of our industry. We're going to be talking about competitiveness in the context of decarbonisation, which is no longer an option. And we're talking about reindustrialising the country and the European continent. How can we move back to a form of sovereignty in a certain number of industrial sectors in a context where, well, the trade balance excluding energy is very much downgraded? So thank you to our 5 participants for being here for this early morning session. Before we start the debate, I'm going to hand over to Lionel Fontagne from the Cercle des Économistes, who's going to be framing the debate. Thank you. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to be framing the debate like an economist. We're going to be talking about fairly general things, but I'm going to take a point of view that is international. As has been reminded, the general idea is to talk about decarbonisation. But we're talking about the strategy of decarbonisation in a competitive industry. So the climate is what economists refer to as a common good. But conserving our climate, which is what we all want, protecting it, it means collective action shared between different countries. Each country has an interest in preserving the climate, but no country has an interest in acting alone because the efforts will be diluted at worldwide scale. Those making the most efforts will have to move around and help countries making fewer efforts. If a country is making a lot of effort, and if the country is big enough like Europe, the fact that Europe is using a lot less fossil fuel will bring down the balance, and that should encourage others to consume more. So all of that is fairly disastrous. So we've tried to find some solutions at international level in order to move forward. There are 3 types of solutions that I'd like to quickly go through. The first is the multilateral solution. We all agree that multilateralism is much better than everything else. And for those who have been coming to X for a long time, you know, multilateralism is not going to provide a solution to everything. In terms of climate, the ambitions are high. And given what we have, we've got the Paris Agreement, which is very good. It's a step forward, but you know how it works. Each country announces in a voluntary manner a level of decarbonisation that it will reach at a certain date. And this is what we heard from William Anda, the Nobel Prize winner. So if you add together what everybody promises to do, then we haven't paid the bill. And not only is it not enough, these commitments are not constraining, they're not obligatory. So Paris, well, multilateralism is just part of the answer. So maybe we need to go towards multilateralism. That's a club of countries that will share the same climate ambition, and that will manage to achieve its ambitious objectives with different means. The only problem, and this is a problem that economists know how to deal with, is to find the common metrics. Billions of dollars spent, efforts made through the markets, efforts based on subsidies, efforts in terms of tax reductions, and efforts in terms of regulations. Economists know how to give an implicit price, a shadow price to all of that, and so we can compare the efforts of each one. The problem is that if we have a club like that, which is made up of the United States for steel, there was the steel club, and that was the European Commission didn't want to hear about this. If ever we did this, we need to protect ourselves at the borders of the club to prevent the problem of the carbon leakage. Theoretically, it's possible, but in practice, geopolitics is very complicated. It's very much full of conflicts, and we will have immediate problems with our Australian friends, our Indian friends, our Chinese friends, etc. So it's not really a solution to have something that's multilateral. So maybe we need unilateral action. So unilateral action, this is what the European Union decided with its Green Deal, the Fit for 55, in the jargon used. And this has been very much mediatized with the environmental side of the Inflation Reduction Act, which aims for the same objective, decarbonizing with the means that we're talking about. They're very different means. Now, the advantage of unilateral action is it means effective commitments on behalf of countries. We're really going to do it. We're really going to move forward. We're really going to decarbonize. But the problem there is that if some do this with market instruments, more than anything else, in other words, prices, price signals like we've done in Europe, whereas others are doing it with subsidies and tax reductions like in the United States, this is going to be problematic. It's going to distort competition, and we'll nevertheless have to protect ourselves. So Europeans are doing it with a border carbon mechanism, and the Americans are doing it with clauses that are specific, clauses that are part of IRA provisions. They suggest making some parts of cars in the United States, the battery, for example. So there are local integration clauses that mean that some of the added value of products comes from the United States. How do we stop having to rely on subsidies? We've got unilateral actions that are necessary with the preservation of what economists call the level playing field, a space for competition that works at international level. This is the theme that our speakers will be debating this morning. Thank you very much, Lionel. So, yes, our 5 speakers. Let us go through the 5 speakers. Hello, Guillaume Faury. So you are the CEO of Airbus. Maciej Witucki, you're the president of the Polish Confederation, Leviathan. You're kind of the MEDEF in Poland. Xavier Pieszowy, you're the president of the board of RTE. Sylvie Gienot, you're the CEO of the company Dalkia. And Goldie Hyder, you're president and head of management of the Business Council of Canada. Thank you to all 5 of you for being here. So we're going to start with by framing things. Xavier said this, decarbonisation. It's about reframing things, providing figures, looking at the carbon emissions of industry. You're saying that decarbonising industry is a big driver. Perhaps it's easier to activate this than looking at household behaviour. Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So just some ideas. I'm going to talk about France because that will be easier for me. So 450 million tons of CO2 emitted a year. The manufacturing industry and construction, out of 450, it's 80 million tons. So that's 20%. And just to give you an idea of this kind of emission, if we just take Dunkirk in the north of France and Fos-sur-Mer in the south of France, we're talking about 2 industrial sites that emit 20 million tons. So you can see that industrial emissions, not just, well, for France, it's important. And they're very much concentrated as well. This concerns a small number of stakeholders. And from this point of view, it's a driver that can be activated with more difficulty than a fine decarbonisation of households, for example. So that's the first thing. And I'd like to come back to what you said about the Fit for 55. It's fairly barbaric, this jargon. It's the union that is committed to reducing its emissions by 55% with respect to 1990. We're only halfway there in France. We were supposed to have started in 1990, but the milestone is 2030. So we've only got 7 years to go. So, you know, we've got our work cut out for us. And when we're looking for big levers for doing this, and let me come back to point number 1, industry and its huge emissions, for example, in Dunkirk and Fos, they can act as drivers, but it's going to be problematic from an investment, a competitiveness point of view, and we'll talk about these things later on. Now, so the question of competitiveness, Guillaume Fourier, in the air sector, you're saying that decarbonisation is more a subject. It's not just the scope 3; it's the use. It's when the airplanes are in the sky. So what about decarbonisation relating to kerosene rather than the building itself of the airplanes? Can you develop that point, please? Yes, hello, everybody. So aviation, it's 2.5% of carbon emissions in the world, so 50 gigatons. So it's a bit more than 1 gigaton. So where do these emissions come from? If I take the example of Airbus, so that's Airbus makes half of the commercial airplanes in the world. Our scope 1 and scope 2, in other words, the company's emissions at worldwide level amount to 1 million tons. However, if we take scope 3 emissions from the fleet of Airbus planes over 1 year, that we're looking at 500 million tons. So it goes down with time, but it's 500 million tons. So our objective is to decarbonize the use of airplanes rather than the factories making airplanes. So 1 million tons, that's a lot, and we have to do something about it. Now, we're talking about a subject that's very much linked to the introduction that was made by Lionel. To do things efficiently and quickly, decarbonisation needs to be a factor of competitiveness. And in some cases, we've got the things are aligned between decarbonisation and competitiveness, but not in all sectors. So today, 25% of the world airplane fleet are the latest generation of airplanes. 3/4 of our airplanes are old. They're from a previous generation. When you replace an old airplane with a new airplane, you reduce by 20 to 40% the carbon emissions for the same flights. So we've got an alignment between competitiveness and decarbonisation in this case. And that's why we're seeing a huge demand for new generation airplanes. And you probably followed what happened in Bourget. We're coming out of COVID, and yet there are many orders for airplanes. Now, the second case where we've got an alignment, it's when we want to invest in order to design tomorrow's planes, in order to continue to reduce consumption and carbon emissions. And today we're investing for a generation of airplanes that will be coming into service between 2035 and 2040, which will allow us to reduce our carbon emissions by 25 to 30%. And again, we've got an alignment between competitiveness and decarbonisation. Now, where we don't have this alignment between competitiveness and industrialization is the second idea, use of fuel. So they're much more expensive than fossil fuels. So this is what Lionel was explaining. So whoever is leading the dance is using more decarbonized fuel, but that's a loss of competitiveness. It's not something that encourages industry to move forward. So how do we come out of this problem? Either we've got to oblige or realign the two. Realigning the two, this is what the United States are doing with IRA. So there are considerable subsidies for decarbonized fuels. So they've becoming competitive, and we're seeing massive investments, and companies are committing to offtake using decarbonized fuels. This works very well, but it's a public policy that is very expensive. It's expensive. It creates a competitiveness factor in the United States compared with the rest of the world. It's not multilateral, so that's why there are lots of responses to this. It's also possible to create a level playing field, so something that's homogeneous for everybody, by obliging people to do things. There you oblige people to accept the idea that it's less competitive, but it's less competitive in the same way for everybody, and so everybody goes down that path. So in an economy that is multi-local, we can do this intelligently. In an economy that's global like aviation, it doesn't work because they're all in competition with each other, and if you agree to be less competitive in order to have a level playing wheel, but you've not got the same thing at the end of the day, then you're penalized. So that's why it's very difficult to move forward with the question of fuels. Now, last year, there was an agreement at world level that was taken to move towards 2050 with complete decarbonization of the aviation sector with several mechanisms, one called CORSIA, which is an offset fuel mechanism, but it's long and it doesn't work very well to begin with. And that's why some regions like Europe have decided to go a lot faster and to be more demanding, because it's all a question of speed. However, agreeing to be less competitive in this field. So there's a real hot topic. That is the question of energy. We need transition. We need a transition at the cost of energy. And access to decarbonized fuel is not expensive. And then this brings us back to the question of humanity. And the last thing that I'll go through very quickly is the use of fuel during flights. You can have long-haul flights, so you can have waiting times, so you can improve air transport systems. But this means a lot of agreements between different countries, and that's why it's very difficult to move ahead swiftly. It's all a question of speed. When you have an alignment, then we can do things ourselves. But if there's no alignment, we need public policies and we need agreements between countries, and that's where the difficulties lie. We all have common interests, but there are also individual competitive interests, and it's this game that we have ahead of us. So, Monsieur Givichuki, you are the representative of the field of people who are not very nice. You're in the coal world. So the cost of what's not expensive means opening mines. You say it's your economic model that is at stake, and the companies that you represent are not necessarily aligned with your executive members. Yes, we've got centuries of tradition, dichotomies between those who govern in the country. And then there's the fact that the government is organizing the elections at the moment. But seriously, we're in the front line because we're very interested. I'm talking about the Polish industry. So it was reindustrialized over the past 30 years, Poland. And Poland today, it's a bit like the suburbs of the German industry, and we're proud of that. But all of that, we're feeling that we're seeing the first signs in the Intel factory. So that's going to be working with the microprocessors. Magdeburg is using green energy we don't have in Poland. The Tesla factory, for example, is next to Berlin because it wants to attract Polish workers, but it wants a German green approach. So the Polish industry is very much conscious of everything. It's very much green. It's almost greener than the center of Europe, of the European Union, because our products really depend on competition. On this little goblet manufactured in Norway, it's white, but if it was made in Poland, it would be black. And people don't want to buy such beakers. It's going to be a tool of competition, not just global competition, as in the case of Airbus, but there's going to be, it relates to European competition. People are going to be using these arguments, and it's normal. So I think that the solution to all of that in Poland, and this is what I hear, is increasingly, we've been talking about it, is increasingly going to be a unilateral solution with a strong federal entity. We'll let competition be managed by countries, not by countries, because otherwise we won't manage things. We're seeing this with the eternal discussion about the color of hydrogen. The French and the Germans and whoever can't agree to what green hydrogen is. They all want to have their own hydrogen being promoted, you know, the real French hydrogen or the real German hydrogen, so to speak. We're seeing this very well. And in Poland, let me remind you that in spite of the image of the bête noire, we have lots of benefits from being members of the European Union. And we've got a lot of potential as well. There are too many negative effects if you want to leaving the structure. So we need to federalize what we can. So things are moving ahead slowly, especially with the crises. Things are progressing. Competition needs to stay. We mustn't be managed by a super European state. In Poland, the government has state companies. So competition needs to belong to private companies. But with respect to standardization and policies, they need to be European. Otherwise, we won't manage things. So the strategy, what Thierry Breton was referring to, the strategic autonomy in France does not exist at European level. Well, only if we take into account Ukraine and human resources. We're not going to manage with our own club. So politicians are beginning to be a bit more courageous when it comes to a common strategy, but they need to leave space for companies so that we've got capitalistic-based competition with central structures, and that will help us to rise to the challenge. And just to finish, decarbonization of Poland, so that we're in line with the Fit for 55 objective, is going to be more expensive than the IRA in the United States. 400 billion euros. So the challenge is really quite considerable. And if we don't do it, the CBM, the carbon tax, is perhaps going to be at the border between Germany and Poland. And we don't want carbon tax to be on the Oder River, because that will kill the success of my country that was built up in the last 30 years. Sylvie Giannou. So it's also about technical solutions, isn't it? And technical solutions, they exist, don't they? We have to go faster and be better. Yes, thank you, Beatrice. Hello, everybody. Let me just open a parenthesis about Dalkia. It's the subsidiary of EDF, and we have solutions. We're a specialist of decarbonization and energy transition in areas, cities, in industry and in buildings by optimizing the energy used on sites and the production of heat. In other words, heating, hot water, all according to low-carbon strategies. So let me come back to what Xavier was saying. It's urgent to decarbonize industry. In France, we're talking about 20% of CO2 emissions that come from industry. And as it's a bit hot in Aix, I don't know whether we're beating a record, but on the 4th of July, we beat a record. It was the hottest day on Earth. So, you know, we need to speed things up. We need to speed things up. And when we look at what's happening in industry, effectively, there are already many, many things to be done. The first subject, which is the subject of this roundtable, it's competitiveness. We need to make energy savings. How can we reduce consumption in industry? All studies show that we can still reduce things by 15 to 20%. So in spite of industrial efforts, when we look at what's happening in France and we look at the lowering of CO2 emissions, we have the impression that France has followed the objectives and been a good pupil. We've already reduced emissions, but we've offset emissions imported. So it's in our interest to reindustrialize. So energy efficiency, sobriety, I think everybody's understood what that means this winter. So when we look at the production of heat on industrial sites, we were talking about Fos and Dunkirk. Heat, it's industrial vapor to dry things out for the agro-food industry. You can imagine what it is. It's a hot topic. 60% of that production of heat is produced based on fossil fuels. So how can we chase this fossil energy? How can we reduce CO2 emissions? Well, today, we know how to produce industrial heat that is low-carbon industrial heat. We're replacing fuel and gas with biomass. Now, of course, there's a question of prioritization. We talked about low-carbon kerosene. There's biomass. But in France, we know how to make big boilers based on fuel wood, on recycled materials, retrieved materials from the yellow bin where there is waste that is sorted. We know how to burn that. It's also a way of producing low-carbon heat. Now, the third element concerns electrification. We're talking a lot about that. We think that the electric mix in industry is going to be doubling. So there's going to be a big need for electrification. For example, when you have a gas oven, if you can replace it by an electric oven, because electricity is low carbon, then it's a good possibility. Another solution is based on hydrogen. Hydrogen with its different colors. Let's talk about low carbon hydrogen. When you're in EDF, low carbon is all about nuclear and renewable energy. So that's going to help us to decarbonize industry. There are many questions around hydrogen, the infrastructures that are associated with hydrogen production. These are subjects that are all being debated. I'd also like to talk about the circular economy and its relation to industrial decarbonization. We know how to recover waste heat. In Dunkirk, for example, you can have 100% renewable energy systems. You can replace gas and fuel boilers in houses, for example. You can produce renewable energy using wood, but also you can pick up heat from a foundry, for example. If you take Stellantis, they make aluminium, and that heat is lost. We can recover it and use it to heat people in a city. That's what they do in Dunkirk with Arcelor. These are subjects being developed. There's a source of waste heat that can be exploited. There's geothermal strategies as well, surface geothermal strategies. There are heat pumps as well that can be associated with geothermal structures and electricity in order to decarbonize industry. And I'm going to finish with something relating to the circular economy. All process recycling systems have to be taken into account. We have to decarbonize energy systems, but also the processes used by industrialists. And when you make copper and aluminium, you're reusing recycled aluminium, and that's all part of the solution. One last point, the very last point. It's concerns residual CO2. We can pick that up. We can sequestrate it. It's what we refer to as carbon capture that is used and stored. So we can pick this up from pipes and we can store that CO2 infini, because those emissions, we don't know how to deal with them. And then just to introduce the subject, and I'll finish there, there are two key success factors that have already been suggested today in the previous speeches. Financing, how do you support these efforts? And then there's also the question of, well, we talked about industry in Germany. Perhaps public powers are helping, but, they're looking for manpower in Poland. So the subject of skills is also another subject.
Thank you, Sylvie. We never talked so much in Europe about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. All European industrialists got scared last fall. So now, how do you look at this in Canada? This like a declaration of war from the US, and finally, how do you see the Canadian or European response? And is it a true danger in most a risk of deindustrialization for the countries?
Well, first of all, good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm showing my mercy on all of you by not sharing my grade 12 Western Canadian French. But I am privileged to be here with this panel, and thank you again for my first time here. We've been talking frameworks. I want to talk facts. Starting with the most obvious fact. Carbon, like COVID, knows no boundaries. So whatever any country does by itself, or whatever any region does by itself, is frankly moot. Just one observation. Two, if we don't help China and we don't help India decarbonize, we're wasting our time. We're responsible for the emissions in China and India as West because we chose them to be our manufacturing hub, to make things we want that are good quality for cheap. That human behavior is not going to change. Something else we need to consider. They are emitting because they're heavily reliant on coal. Why? because we have failed to be able to get them gas and other sources of decarbonizing energy that they need. Okay? We've had false debates about nuclear. I know France is one of the welcome places I can talk about this, but Canadians are very proud of nuclear. But for the longest time, environmentalists drove an agenda that was anti-nuclear. That is incoherent with the facts. Any study you have seen will say you will not achieve net zero without nuclear mix. And yet, we have allowed that narrative to take hold. However, the Russia reset, as I call it, is a moment to bring back the facts. The facts are fossil fuels will continue to be used for decades, at least 2 to 3 decades. Not my assessment. OECD's own analysis shows this. So you have to make sure you're getting access to as clean energy of fossil fuels as you can. That's a requirement that we should be doing, which means building the infrastructure to be able to get it to market. It's difficult for Europe to have LNG because you're relying right now on Russia. You frankly get more, you're still getting a lot of gas from Russia. It's somewhat of a well-kept secret, but the truth is you're getting a lot of it. And we've got to make sure that we can help you decarbonize. And this Russia reset is a moment for us to look at how are we going to help each other. We cannot do it on our own. The other thing, and this has been mentioned a lot at this conference, and it's a universal theme in the C-suites, certainly that I speak with, and that is the consequence of the decline of democracy. There are less democracies in the world today than there were 25 years ago. So if we have the best system, why are we losing? What is it that we've done to ourselves that have created an environment in which capital that is agnostic on ideology, that is agnostic on nationality, is going to the places where it's more welcome, where it has better public policy, where it has more confidence, more stability, more predictability to be deployed to realize the purpose of that deployment. If we don't fix democracies, if we continue to attack public institutions in our narratives at all opportunities, if we have a political environment that is no longer based on common sense, it certainly isn't based on leadership, mostly followership. If black becomes white after every election, how is business supposed to invest with any sense of long-term predictability, confidence that capital will be welcomed, that it can be deployed, and that its purpose can eventually be realized? If we don't fix that, we won't be able to play in this game at all. So what did the Americans do about this? They created the IRA. The very ill-named, but the IRA is effectively industrial policy. And one thing about America, you never short her. When she goes big or she goes home. Now the problem is, when you talk about words like friendshoring and nearshoring, things that attributed to America, Janet Yellen and others, it cannot mean America shoring. And for many, that's what it has meant. Europe's own response was to come together to say we have to compete with America's aggressive movement, and good for them for being able to do it, but the rest of us don't have the global currency of the world. So the race to the bottom with subsidies is only going to get you so far. Never mind the deficits and the debts that that's going to create. I think we have to do a better job of coordinating industrial policy so that we're not all doing the same things, so that we don't become reliant like semiconductors in one place of the world, that we're able to make sure that we have access to key things that are going to be necessary as we go forward. But does the consumer care where the Apple phone is made? Probably not. What the consumer wants in a variety of other things is best product, cheapest price. And I don't think we should believe that human nature or human behavior is going to change. And if you don't believe me, see Germany. When Germany moved too quickly on renewables, they didn't bring the public with them. And the public started to experience natural gas prices, affected partly by Russia, of a 500% increase in their utilities costs. And they said, look, I care, I just can't afford it. And so what did Germany have to do? Turn on coal. And so we've got to make sure that we bring the public with us when we're moving in this direction, because populism is our biggest threat today, from the left and the right. Both sides are putting polarization in play where the logic of the center is being lost. It doesn't even have a voice anymore. Most of the choices in democracies are black or white when the vast majority of people are gray. We are people of the radical middle. We're progressively, we're progressive on social issues. We're fiscal, conservatives on fiscal issues. This is the nature of human beings in many parts of our democracies, but they don't have a voice anymore in our system. And so how do we bring that about? And the last point I just want to make about industrial policy is this, another fact. Many, many organizations have made their commitments for 2050 net zero, but if you ask them honestly, they will tell you today they don't know how they're going to do it. They may know 25%, 30%, 50%. Sure, some have been able to find a way to do it all today. But the vast majority of CEOs I speak would say, I've been forced to make this commitment. Fiduciary duty says I should know how I'm going to do it. I don't, but I'm going to make the commitment anyways. Which means we're all going to rely heavily on innovation. And that innovation is, a lot of it is Canadian-led, by the way. I'm very proud of our industries that are driving the change on CCUS. 8 of our members are putting over $85 billion into how to get carbon captured. But remember, capturing carbon is a cost. There's no value to the carbon today. And so how much societal good are businesses responsible for? And this is where the industrial policy of sharing that and having skin in the game is going to be so important. We're going to need to clean our grids. We're going to have to do a lot more with nuclear, particularly small modular nuclear reactors, which again, Canada's at the forefront of. Hydrogen, there's a lot of dispute and debate about as to how it's going to be used or not. It's very complicated, it's very expensive, and it's very difficult to move. So we'll see how it all unfolds. But I don't think any of these things I've just mentioned are imminent. And that's the other fact that I wanted to just leave you with. We can't let hype get ahead of the facts. These things are not around the corner. We know we're the ones doing them. It's going to take some time. And so we've got to make sure that we're creating the conditions to play the long game and not just the short game here.
Thank you, Goldie.
So we've just been told about the IRA and then its political impacts. Now I'd like to hear you, all of you, on the European response to the IRA, the US IRA. So now there is the Green Deal, the net zero emission. There are many money on the table. I think there is money all over the place. So is it sufficient? Is it well calibrated? Does it make it possible to keep competitiveness or to respond sufficiently to what is being done elsewhere in the US, but also possibly in China? Now, let's start with you, Mr. Lionel Faure, and then I'll listen to the 4 of you. What was said by Goldie is very inspiring and true, so true. We need to create long-term conditions. This is essential because this transformation is deep and it will take time. Now, when we play the long game, long-term vision, you also have to move fast, nevertheless. And in order to respond to the question about the IRA, well, there's an expression, what's simple is false, but what is not simple cannot be used. The IRA is a bit simplistic, but it's very powerful. And we see the investment going rapidly towards the utilization of IRA subsidies. And we've seen the US, which were late on decarbonation, accelerating in this domain, which is quite in a spectacular way. Now, is the European response at the level of the IRA? Well, I don't know. Well, if I want to be optimistic, I say we don't know yet. If I want to be pessimistic, I said it's such a patchwork of small, complex solutions, sometimes contradictory, and which leaves room to different solutions in different countries. I'm not too optimistic. It's not that the intention is not there, but the complexity of the system is such that it could lead us to what is simple is false, but what is not simple cannot be utilized. So I'm very worried about the efficacy and the European response, which reflect the difficulty we face to agree among ourselves. It was said differently here among Europeans to have something simple and efficient, and for the investment to join, to be deployed for capital to be deployed and to find the return of this investment, we need a single play field and long-term vision. Today in Europe, we lack that direly. Yeah, it's more vision than money, actually. It's more the joint normalization than money. When you see IRA, $360 billion US, just a few months before, the European industrialists were scared by the Germans who put 200 billion euros into support to German businesses after the energy crisis. So it's more than half of the IRA. So if we sum up everything in the 27 countries, we could cover that. So what is cover what is done in the US? So it's not a question of means. We have the means. It's not an issue of market. We have the market, 500 million European consumers. But today it is scattered, disordered, and we are other Europe gets together or it will disappear. So either we invest absolutely now for the green fuels for new airplanes, or let's invest in the restoration of historical heritage so that the rich American will come and see us and visit us. So discussion on common standard. Let me give you an example. We talk about nuclear power plant. Okay, the Sweden still has nuclear power plant, but they have a law which prohibits to do research, uranium research on their territory, because they clean trees and mountains. So they want us to keep the bush to look for uranium. So with countries with situations like that in each country, we'll never be able to. You can do 100 conferences in X on the fact that we're late behind the Americans or tomorrow India or China, but we'll never. Either we work together or we will fail. So does the European response goes through what we call the market design, the operation of the market for energy? Well, the world of carbon neutrality, the second is the world of biomass and recovery. So the rest is electricity, which tomorrow will be majority. Well, it is in progress, but it's not finished. There is a reform going on now of the European market for electricity, and we still don't agree among countries. In my opinion, we have to go for two conditions. We have to offer stable, long-term electricity prices to the industrialists. They need to invest, so they need a horizon so that their investment would be profitable. That's the first thing, stability. And of course, then there is the question of price. The fact that electricity, and we've seen that during the crisis, the electricity price is indexed to the gas price without any possible regulation. This is a problem. We need to find a device that will pool prices towards the real effective production cost. It's a real challenge. So the restructuration of the market, it's in progress, and we have to change some reactions to production. We said we will consume more electricity tomorrow, so we'll have to produce more. So far, so good. But once this being said, we have to tackle issues that state support policies. This is getting more flexible, but we have not reached the end of the road. What's interesting in that in the industrial decarbonation, we have to tackle our real problem, principle, historical vision, so that we offer people like Guillaume a stable framework for long-term investment. Let me take an example. If the air industry, the aeronautic industry tomorrow uses hydrogen-based fuel, which is itself produced by electrolysis, which is produced by electricity. So we have to provide an affordable fuel to the air industry. So we need to produce electricity, which is decarbonated and, of course, cheap. Last point. All this goes through infrastructures because this electricity, tomorrow's electricity, has to be produced. We have to consume it indeed. Among the two, we need infrastructures and networks, but And when the first European work started, there was nothing on the networks. So for tomorrow, this will be tens and tens of billions of investments. So we've corrected that, and there will be some kind of a large roundtable in September with, on networks. But it is an illustration of the fact that we haven't been able to globally tackle the problem. And I'll be kind of feel good. There are blocks, but then we can discuss the operation of the market, the state support, and the grids, infrastructures. We haven't been able yet to produce a global answer. So let's hope it will come. Sylvie Goldie, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I'm sure there are plenty of questions. Well, rapidly. And in addition, I want to come with an optimistic note. When I'm listening to my team, I said, we've never been in such a storm. I mean, clearly there are calls for projects, there are requests from our clients, there is action on the field, it's speeding up. Clearly. Now, and in all countries where we are, in Middle East, Poland, wherever, in the UK, US, so things are moving. In France, there are calls for projects regularly to change the fuel and or gas boilers. So, France 2030, more 20 billion for decarbonation, or more than. I can't remember many billion on the hydrogen, but it is speeding up, and the trend is on. So, okay, let's look at the glass half full. Now, Denis, you want to ask a couple of points?
Yeah, I just wanted to say two things that I think need to be reconciled. One is the fact that carbon tax is not a normal application in different parts of the world, starting with the United States of America, that doesn't have a carbon tax. And so it's complicated from a policy environment when you're having different responses on something as basic as market mechanism as possible. I'm proud to say that the Canadian business community I represent endorsed the carbon tax in 2008, and despite pressure from different political parties of different stripes throughout, we have held our course because the fact is it's the best mechanism from a market perspective to be able to price the carbon. The second thing I think we need to look at more globally, and this is about the framework point, is emissions, as I said at the outset, don't respect any borders. So if a country like, say, Canada has a lot of LNG and there's a global demand for it, but we're debating internally in our country that if we export that LNG, it will have the net effect of raising Canadian emissions and therefore making it harder for us to reach our targets. However, if we were able to get that LNG to market, to Japan, Korea, India, all kinds of places, the overall global emissions would be reduced. We would get no credit for that. And so we're landlocking ourselves in our LNG for the most part. We're distributing some, but not a lot. We could do a lot more. And the debate inside the country is this, and I think it's a false debate. If you are an environmentalist and you believe that we have to address climate change to the level that we all do, then the goal should be to reduce global emissions. You shouldn't be punished if your emissions may go up or may have to go up to help bring down global emissions. I thought that was the objective.
Do we have questions from the audience? No questions? Raise your hand. Don't be shy. Come on, madam. Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. Two questions. First, to Mr. Canada, says the lady. Canada has been recognized for this energy policy, very specific. Could you dwell on that? Second question has to do with all speakers. And Dalkia, what's the role of digital in your decarbonization policy?
I'm proud to say, as I mentioned, that the Canadian business community and the Canadian energy sector in particular long ago committed to the transition, long ago has set goals in place, but we're driven by facts. And the facts is there are demands that are going to continue for oil and gas. Even Norway, which built its sovereign wealth fund on oil, has now come back after telling everybody else to not do it and relaunched their oil platforms and their programs. Because the facts are, as I said, what they are. There is increasing demand as the global population grows and as the middle class grows, particularly in Indo-Pacific and in Asia more broadly. And so we're going to have to make sure that we can meet that in the most environmentally friendly way, addressing CSR and stuff. The Canadian energy sector is also cognizant that doing good is good business. And so we have a duty to drive towards the policies that our governments have put in place to achieve 2030 targets and 2050 targets. The problem is these targets just get picked. And the truth is we're a long ways. All of us, frankly, I think very few countries are going to meet their targets. We didn't meet Kyoto, we didn't meet Paris, we probably won't meet whatever comes up, Copenhagen and other things next. Because we keep setting targets without looking at how is it that we're going to get there. And I think that's a critical component. And I just want to repeat, the role of innovation is going to be central to this. You know, to capture carbon, to move it, to store it. It doesn't get stored anywhere. There's a certain kind of places where it gets stored is key. Small modular nuclear reactors. Hydrogen, as I mentioned, it's so complicated. It has to be frozen at like minus 200 degrees on a ship to be sent to Europe. You have to like maybe break it up and put it back together. You have to have the capacity to export it and receive it. It's probably more industrial in nature. I don't think it'll be very commercial in nature, but these are things that the Canadian business community are leading the charge on. I just think we would benefit from a more coherent global policy that would allow us to help other countries decarbonize, even if our emissions might creep up and may affect our targets.
Merci. Une réponse,
Alors,
Sylvie et Madame.
Le numérique, une réponse rapide. Alors d'abord, on a tendance...
Quick answer about digital. Well, everybody is pinpointing digital. Your CO2 emission from IT, 6% digital. But digital is data centers, it's electricity. So electricity will be decarbonated. Digital will be decarbonated. And by the way, we know how to collect, we recover the heat from the data centers to warm up housing. So part of the solution for two reasons. We'll use digital to deal with the consumption data, all consumption data of our clients and industrialists, and including to do energy savings, energy efficacy, first axis, second main axis. We will manage energy ecosystems. I've listed the solutions, but often on one side there will be all the solutions, including the storage solutions, and therefore we will have to manage energy so that at the right time we'll consume as little as possible and as best as possible and with the lowest carbon level. And this will be thanks to the digital system. Any other question? One at the back, very back. Hello. Geothermal, geophysician, engineer, a member of a climate association. So could we ask ourselves, well, could we all ponder the issue of hydrogen and the need of, the resources needed for that, be it for the production of, but also for the water resources, because nobody talks about that. But in fact, we come to a period when water is becoming scarce, so we'll give priority to water for the farmers, possibly before giving water to produce hydrogen to fly planes, and possibly to give it keep a bit for our industries, we need also, which need water, as well. So I would like to respond to the hydrogen and the issue of water. Each country has its own strategy when it comes to hydrogen. What we should bear in mind that the first usage for hydrogen would be to replace the hydrogen used for the industry. That will be the priority. This is where we have the first economic space, and then afterwards it can be used for storage, electricity, or mobility. But you're right to say that there are issues of water resources in dams, rivers in France, but there's the ocean. Well, today the largest future hydrogen producer would be on the seaside. Of course, you have to do seawater desalination. You need highly pure water, but you know there is emergency here. So I think it's reasonable even to decarbonize the industry. You know, when you see we need to do water electrolysis. You know, this will be resource consuming. You know, it's there is water in the ocean, 71% of the surface of the earth. So let's start with that. Let's not increase difficulties to say that we won't make it. Well, we already have a very ambitious goal, 2030, 35, 2050. Hydrogen will play a role, definitely. But, you know, there are difficulties. Let's not hide it. I know there are many other questions, but maybe you will ask them just after the roundtable. I know our speakers will stay for a couple of minutes. Now, I give the floor to the end word to Lionel. And thank you in advance to the 5 speakers. It was most fascinating. The last word, Lionel. Well, the last word, 2 phrases, because we're already running at below 0 in terms of time. So we have to rush. So first point that, well, microeconomic dimension of the discussion, we talked about sobriety, and you've seen that the Cercle des Économistes is implementing this because we replaced air conditioning of the amphitheater of the university by a fan that has been distributed to each and every one of you. Great example of sobriety, except the interpreters are sweating here. But anyway, so it was a lot of things been said, but you know, as economists, what I want to keep in mind from this interesting session is that we're dealing with a dynamic issue. Now, how do we manage urgency to act with the necessity to have a long-term vision? So this is it's a conventional economic problem, which is not easy. Economic always think that what can help solve the dynamic problem would be to have prices, to have visibility on prices, not absolute price, but on relative prices of the carbonated energy versus the non-carbonated energy. So what we need, absolutely, it was said here, is to have visibility in 2030, 40 of those relative prices between carbonated and non-carbonated energy. And it applies to industries in Poland. It applies to Airbus, manufacturing planes, but what fuel will be used to fly those planes. So this is at the core of the topic. We need energy, but also we need to know what will be the relative price of energy, carbonated versus non-decarbonated. And economists think, and I would like to insist on that, this is a message not always heard, that the price signal is something key, even though there could be other public policies that could be used, instruments. So let's move on this topic, as we've done in this, as the Canadians have done, together with Europe and many other countries. About 60 countries in the world now have a carbon price, one way or another. So it's a good way, from the economist viewpoint, to really to address this dynamic issue, which said let's act rapidly now, but with long-term perspective. That was bad French indeed. Okay.